Before the sun rises, before the world remembers its shape, winter has already decided what it will take, and it does not ask permission. There are no borders here, no centuries, no names that matter. There is only cold moving freely across open land, pressing into lungs, stiffening fingers, and testing every mistake humans have ever made when they believed standing upright was the natural way to survive. You are close to the ground now, so close that your breath smells faintly of soil and ash, and the wind above you loses its voice before it can reach your skin. Snow gathers without asking, but it does not touch you. The earth does not rush. The earth remembers warmth. This is not a cave, and it is not desperation. This is a decision, made quietly, repeated patiently, and refined through winters that did not forgive error. Tonight, we are going beneath the surface to understand how Native American communities. Before we continue, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into history, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, only if it truly brings you peace. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Somewhere else, someone is also listening in the dark. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let the world above fade, because survival here does not begin with strength, but with listening. Long before hands dug into frozen soil, people listened. They listened to how snow behaved differently in shallow hollows, how the ground beneath leaves and grass held warmth even when the air above burned the lungs, how silence returned more quickly when the earth stood between you and the wind. Press your palm down and you feel it. Cold, yes, but not cruel. The earth gives slowly, and it takes slowly. That difference mattered. Across North America, many Native American groups learned, often through loss, that no wall of wood, no stretched hide, no standing structure could match what the ground itself offered during long, lethal winters. Semi-subterranean and fully underground shelters were not clever inventions imagined in comfort. They were answers shaped by grief, by memory, and by winters that killed those who misjudged them. Historians still debate whether the first underground shelters were intentional designs or gradual adaptations, shallow pits becoming deeper, windbreaks becoming homes. But what is clear is this: once people understood that warmth could be stolen by wind, but not easily taken from the earth, everything changed. Below the surface, there is no wind chill. There is no sudden gust undoing hours of careful fire tending. Sound softens. Snow absorbs noise. Soil rounds sharp edges. Winter above is loud. Trees cracking, ice shifting, wind howling like something searching. Below ground, sound becomes a murmur. Ears relax, even when the mind remains alert. Imagine the first winter someone stayed underground through the night. The fear of collapse, the strange sensation of being wrapped by earth instead of exposed to sky, and then morning arrives, and they are still breathing. Fingers still move. Frost has not claimed them. That is how knowledge begins. Not with celebration, but with relief. Many early shelters were not deep at first, sometimes barely a meter below the surface, just enough to break the wind and tap into the earth's stable temperature. Over generations, depth increased as confidence grew. People noticed patterns where frost reached, where soil flooded in spring, where it stayed dry. This was engineering without drawings, architecture without paper. Walls curved not for beauty but for survival. Straight edges failed, rounded ones held. Clay behaved differently than sand. Loam cradled better than gravel. Knowledge travelled quietly, passed hand to hand, winter to winter. Fire changed underground too. Flames were no longer allowed to roar. Too much heat meant suffocation. Too little meant frost creeping back. Embers became trusted more than flames. Heat was absorbed by walls and released slowly, long after fire rested. You feel it now, the calm settling into your muscles, breath deepening, fear becoming manageable. There is something deeply human about lowering yourself, about choosing stillness instead of resistance. Some scholars suggest underground living tapped into instincts older than agriculture, echoing animal behavior and prehistoric memory. Others argue practicality alone drove the choice. The debate remains open, layered like soil itself. What matters is this: winter stopped being something to fight head-on. Survival became a matter of positioning. You shift slightly, and feel how warmth lingers where movement is minimal. Stillness keeps heat. Movement wastes it. The ground does not promise comfort. It offers continuity, and continuity in winter is enough. As you descend deeper, you begin to understand that you are not leaving the world behind, only stepping into a version of it where winter has fewer tools. Above ground, cold announces itself loudly, through violence and motion, through sudden shifts that punish exposed skin and drain the body's strength. Below the surface, everything slows, temperature stops swinging wildly, air no longer attacks the lungs, the earth absorbs shock the way deep water absorbs sound. For many Native American communities, this stability was not a luxury but a requirement for survival. On the Great Plains, where the land offers no natural barriers and winter storms can race across open ground without resistance, standing structures quickly became liabilities. Wood was scarce, and anything raised above the surface collected snow, invited wind, and bled heat. Lowering the living space into the ground removed winter's sharpest weapons in a single decision. These shelters were never dug at random. Shape mattered as much as depth. Straight walls failed under pressure, while curved ones carried the weight of snow outward into the surrounding earth. Circular and oval forms resisted collapse, not because they were elegant, but because they were honest responses to gravity and cold. Snow piling above did not crush the shelter. It sealed it, turning danger into insulation. The entrance itself was part of the design. It was kept low and narrow, forcing the body to crouch, not as discomfort but as protection. Cold air sinks, and a lowered entrance trapped it away from sleeping areas. In many cases, entrances were angled or offset from the main living space, creating a cold pocket where icy air could settle harmlessly, while warmth remained deeper inside. Standing upright was a luxury winter could not afford. Adaptability mattered more than pride. Inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. Wind vanished, sound softened, breath no longer crystallized mid-air. Even fear behaved differently here, losing its sharp edges. Fires were placed carefully, never allowed to roar. Underground, fire was not a spectacle. It was a controlled presence. Heat spread laterally, absorbed by earth walls that released it slowly. Long after flames settled into embers, too much fire stole oxygen, too little invited frost. Balance was learned through attention, not theory. Archaeological evidence shows that ventilation was understood intuitively. Smoke holes were shaped and adjusted, sometimes narrowed during storms, sometimes widened on clear days. Airflow was guided, never forced. The shelter breathed, responding to weather without surrendering warmth. Mistakes happened and some cost lives, but knowledge accumulated quietly through repetition. Winter was a strict teacher, but a consistent one. You notice how your body responds. Muscles relax, breathing deepens. The constant readiness demanded by open winter fades. Underground living was not about comfort in the modern sense. It was about recovery. A body that could rest survived longer. A mind not constantly startled made better decisions. These shelters provided both. The earth here does not promise ease. It offers predictability. And in winter, predictability is everything. You begin to sense that this descent was not a retreat, but a repositioning. Instead of standing against winter, people stepped beneath it, allowing the land to absorb what the human body could not. Survival did not come from fighting harder, but from listening more closely and choosing stillness where movement wasted heat. After the descent comes adjustment, because going underground is not enough on its own. Survival depends on how space is shaped, how heat is allowed to move, and how bodies learn where warmth chooses to stay. Inside these shelters, nothing is placed randomly. Every position reflects lessons learned during nights, when cold slipped in quietly and stayed. Sleeping areas were never centered. The middle belonged to movement, work, and fire. Warmth traveled outward, drifting slowly along the walls, settling where people rested. Mats and bedding were placed slightly elevated, sometimes on low platforms of packed clay or wood, because even a small rise reduced heat loss into the ground. Cold sinks, heat lingers. Bodies followed that rule instinctively. Over time, the floor itself changed. Repeated use compacted the earth, forming shallow depressions where people slept generation after generation. These were not designed features. They were imprints of survival. The shelter remembered where warmth lasted longest, and bodies returned to those places without discussion. Fire was treated with restraint. Flames were allowed only as long as necessary. Embers were trusted more. Heat absorbed by earth walls returned slowly through the night, turning the shelter itself into a reservoir. Archaeological layers of ash show careful management, not neglect. Old ash was sometimes removed, sometimes left deliberately, because too much insulated embers from air, while too little allowed heat to escape too quickly. Even ash had a role to play. Ventilation required constant attention. Smoke was red like weather. Its thickness, its smell, its movement told people when to adjust an opening or shift a covering. Air was guided through subtle changes rather than forceful openings. Too much airflow invited cold. Too little invited suffocation. Balance was not calculated. It was felt. As you lie still, you notice how silence thickens. Underground, sound does not travel far. Wind loses its aggression. Snow pressing above does not crash or creak. It settles. That quiet mattered. Rest preserved energy. Energy preserved life. Winter punished exhaustion faster than hunger. Communal living intensified this effect. These shelters were rarely designed for solitude. Body heat multiplied. Several people sharing space created a stable pocket of warmth that no individual could maintain alone. Winter compressed life inward, turning cooperation into the simplest option. Fire tending rotated. Tasks shifted. No one carried survival alone. Children learned without being taught. They felt where cold crept in and avoided it the next night. They learned where warmth gathered simply by sleeping well. Knowledge passed through sensation, not instruction. The shelter itself corrected mistakes gently but firmly. Even posture mattered. Standing wasted heat. Crouching conserved it. Lying close to the ground felt counterintuitive at first, but the body learned quickly. Underground living reshaped instinct. Movement slowed, reactions softened. Winter no longer demanded constant vigilance. Outside, storms rearranged the surface of the world. Inside, change arrived slowly, almost politely. Time stretched, days blurred. The shelter became a place where the body could recover rather than merely endure. And as the night deepened and the fire settled into quiet embers, the earth continued its steady work, holding warmth, softening sound, and teaching patience without ever raising its voice. Warmth alone was never enough. A shelter could hold heat perfectly and still fail if the body had nothing left to burn. Underground living only worked because it was paired with something just as carefully planned and just as quiet. Food storage beneath the frost line where winter could not reach it easily. Beneath your feet, beyond where warmth settles, the earth continues working in a different way. Storage pits were dug into the same stable soil as the shelter itself, close enough to reach without stepping fully into winter, but far enough to avoid moisture and pests. These spaces stayed cool without freezing solid, dry without exposure to wind, and steady when the surface above swung violently between thaw and ice. Roots, dried meat, seeds, and rendered fat waited here in silence. Nothing was rushed. Winter eating was not about fullness. It was about pacing. Calories were measured against movement, against cold, against how long the night would last. Underground storage calmed the mind as much as it fed the body. Knowing food waited safely below reduced panic, and panic burned energy faster than hunger. The ceiling of these pits mattered as much as their depth. Layers of bark, woven mats, clay, and packed soil closed openings carefully. Earth above acted as a lid that breathed slowly, shielding food from sudden temperature shifts. These coverings were not meant to hide food from people, but from time, from fluctuation, from surprise. Archaeological layers show repeated opening and resealing, evidence of careful monitoring rather than neglect. Food was checked by smell, by texture, by instinct sharpened through winter. Mistakes were costly. Knowledge accumulated quietly. Some pits were inspected daily, others trusted for longer stretches depending on climate and contents. No single method ruled everywhere. In some sites, small objects appear near storage spaces, placed deliberately rather than dropped. These were not decorations. They suggest respect for what sustained life through months of scarcity. Food was not simply resource, it was relationship. Waste was rare, bones were cracked for marrow, fat was saved with care. Nothing edible was taken lightly. The shelter and the storage worked together. Heat preserved bodies. Food preserved strength. One without the other failed quickly. Together they allowed sleep without constant calculation, rest without fear of waking weaker than the night before. As you lie still, you feel the reassurance of this arrangement. Warmth above, nourishment below. The earth holding both, evenly, patiently. Winter continues its work on the surface, but beneath it, time slows and stability takes over. The shelter is no longer just a refuge. It is a system, and systems, when quiet and balanced, rarely announce themselves. Not every underground shelter was meant to last forever, and this was not a flaw but a kind of wisdom learned slowly through repetition. Winter demanded one answer, summer another, and survival depended on knowing when to stay and when to leave without resentment. Many Native American groups built their underground homes specifically for the cold months, then allowed them to fade back into the land once warmth returned. As spring approached, the shelter's purpose quietly ended. Roofs were partially dismantled, entrances sealed with soil, fire pits cleared. These were not abandoned spaces. They were closed deliberately, protected from becoming hazards to animals or people, and prepared to be rebuilt when winter returned. Archaeological evidence often shows careful closure rather than neglect, suggesting anticipation rather than departure driven by failure. Seasonal movement shaped everything. People followed food sources, water cycles, and animal migrations, returning to familiar wintering grounds year after year. Underground shelters were anchors, not prisons. Stability did not come from permanence, but from predictability. Knowing where warmth could be found when the cold returned mattered more than keeping the same walls standing year-round. Markers were subtle. A stone placed just so, a tree scarred in a recognizable pattern, a slope remembered by the way snow melted first in spring. These were not signs meant for outsiders. They were quiet cues readable only by those who already knew where to look. The landscape itself carried instructions. There is ongoing debate among historians about how these seasonal shelters shaped social life. Some evidence suggests that winters drew families together into shared spaces, strengthening cooperation and shared identity. Other findings point to smaller household shelters, indicating a balance between closeness and autonomy. Geography, climate, and culture shaped the answer differently in each place. What remains consistent is restraint. Building only what winter required conserved energy and materials. Overbuilding invited exhaustion. Underbuilding invited danger. These shelters found the narrow path between the two, shaped by winters that rewarded balance and punished excess. You feel this intention in the way the space holds you now. Nothing here insists on being remembered. The shelter does not mark territory or claim permanence. It exists to serve a season, then yield without argument. This willingness to disappear kept landscapes functional. No scars announced ownership. No structure demanded maintenance when it was no longer needed. The earth healed over entrances gently, absorbing what had served its purpose. As you lie still, you sense how this rhythm shaped perception of home. Home was not a fixed structure. It was a relationship with timing. Shelter appeared when winter arrived and dissolved when it left. Survival meant aligning with that cycle rather than resisting it. The ground remains ready, patient, unchanged in its essential nature. And when winter returns, it will offer the same answer again to those who remember how to ask. As winters grew longer and more demanding in certain regions, underground shelter stopped being only a seasonal answer and slowly became something deeper, a place not just for survival but for gathering, where cold forced people inward not only physically but socially. In these moments, shelter transformed into center. Archaeological patterns across the northern plains and plateau regions reveal the emergence of large pit houses and earth lodges, structures dug deep enough to reach stable temperatures and wide enough to hold extended families through the harshest months. These were not rushed constructions. They were planned well in advance of snowfall, often rebuilt in the same locations year after year, turning winter survival into a predictable routine rather than a gamble. Posts were set deliberately, not randomly, anchored into walls that curved gently to distribute pressure. Roof beams were kept short to prevent sagging, layered carefully so weight traveled outward into the earth instead of downward into living space. Snow was expected, it was welcomed. It sealed warmth rather than threatening collapse. Inside, space compressed life inward. Distance wasted heat, closeness preserved it. Sleeping areas formed a ring along the walls, bodies arranged not by chance but by need, sharing warmth in a way no single fire could replicate. The center remained open for work, food preparation, and teaching. Fire sat low, steady, watched but not indulged. Heat moved slowly, predictably, shaped by walls that remembered yesterday's warmth and released it long after flames faded. Communal living reshaped behavior. Fire tending rotated. Tasks were shared. No one carried the full burden of winter alone. Even responsibility was distributed to conserve energy and attention. Archaeological wear patterns suggest repeated movement along the same paths, the same sitting places, the same sleeping spots, forming a rhythm that reduced friction in confined space. Structure replaced freedom. Routine replaced choice. In winter, that trade kept people alive. Children absorbed this environment without formal instruction. They learned where warmth settled by sleeping well. They learned where cold crept in by waking uncomfortable. Correction came from sensation, not command. Knowledge passed quietly through repetition, rather than explanation. The shelter itself became teacher, rewarding correct behavior with comfort and punishing carelessness gently but consistently. Sound changed meaning here. Loudness wasted energy. Silence preserved it. Conversation softened. Storytelling lengthened. Long winter nights turned shelters into places where memory and skill passed from one generation to the next without ceremony. Teaching happened while hands worked and bodies rested. Survival knowledge was not separated from life, it was life. There remains debate among scholars about whether these communal winter shelters strengthened cooperation or intensified tension. Evidence supports both interpretations. Confined spaces amplify everything: care, conflict, patience, fatigue. What remains clear is that winter made isolation expensive. Togetherness, even when difficult, was often the simpler option. As you lie still, you feel how the shelter holds not just heat but presence. The warmth you feel is not only from fire or earth, but from shared stillness. Winter presses hard from above but below. Life compresses into something dense and resilient, a quiet resistance shaped not by force but by proximity. And as the night deepens, the shelter does what it was built to do, holding bodies, holding warmth, holding time itself in a slow, patient balance while winter continues its long work outside. Fire underground was never instinctive. It had to be learned, negotiated, and constantly respected, because below the surface flame behaves differently, and mistakes linger longer. Above ground, smoke escapes upward without resistance. Heat races away into open air, and failure announces itself quickly. Below ground, nothing leaves unless invited. Fire becomes intimate, demanding attention not through drama but through subtle warning. Inside these shelters, fire was placed low, often in shallow pits rather than raised hearths, encouraging warmth to spread sideways instead of vanishing upward. This was not accidental. Heat that rose too quickly was wasted, and heat that lingered too high never reached resting bodies. Underground living reversed priorities. Warmth belonged near the floor where people slept and worked slowly through winter days. Ventilation was never fixed. It responded, openings were shaped carefully, then adjusted daily. A mat shifted slightly. A cover angled a few degrees. A dampened layer placed briefly to slow airflow during storms. Smoke was read the way others read clouds. Its color mattered. Its speed mattered. Its smell mattered. Too thick meant danger. Too thin meant wasted heat. Balance lived in between. Archaeological evidence shows repeated adjustment rather than rigid design. Soot patterns change over time. Openings widen, then narrow again. Fire pits are reshaped, not replaced. These shelters were not engineered once and trusted forever. They were tuned continuously, like an instrument that responded to weather and season. Fire management became a shared responsibility. No single person controlled it for long. Tending rotated, especially during the night, when embers were allowed to glow quietly instead of burning brightly. This conserved fuel and oxygen, and it kept the shelter warm without disturbing sleep. Embers were trusted because they were predictable. Flames were treated cautiously because they were not. Children learned fire behavior early, not through instruction but through proximity. They watched how adults waited before adding fuel, how they listened to the fire rather than staring at it, how they adjusted the shelter instead of forcing the flame. Fire was never dominant here. It was cooperative. There is ongoing discussion among researchers about how deep shelters could safely go before ventilation became too risky. Some argue that depth was limited primarily by air movement, others by soil stability and labor. The truth varies by place. What is clear is that underground fire demanded humility. You could not overpower it, you had to work with it. As you lie still, you feel the difference between heat that shouts and heat that stays. Underground warmth does not impress. It reassures, it does not demand attention. It allows rest. Winter punished arrogance quickly. Shelters that treated fire casually did not last. Shelters that listened did. And as the embers settle into their quiet glow, the shelter breathes gently around them, holding warmth where it belongs, reminding anyone inside that survival here was never about brilliance, but about restraint learned slowly, night after night. Sleep underground was not an afterthought. It was part of the design, shaped by long observation of how warmth moved, where it lingered, and where it vanished without warning. In winter, rest was not indulgence. It was survival. A body that slept deeply healed faster, burned fewer calories, and woke ready to face another day of cold without panic. Sleeping places were chosen carefully. They followed heat, not habit. Along the curved walls, warmth drifted outward from the fire and settled low, creating invisible zones where the night was gentler. Mats were layered thickly, sometimes renewed several times through a single winter, as plant fibers compacted and lost their insulating power. Bedding was not decoration. It was maintenance. Elevation mattered more than softness. Even a slight rise above the floor reduced heat loss dramatically. Cold air pooled low. Warm air hovered just above it. Bodies learned this quickly. A poor sleeping spot taught its lesson within minutes. A good one allowed the night to pass almost unnoticed. No explanation was required. The body remembered. Over time, the shelter itself recorded these choices. Floors wore down where people rested most often, shallow hollows forming slowly beneath generations of sleep. These depressions were not planned. They were evidence. Warmth shaped space as surely as tools did. Posture changed underground. Pillows were thin or absent. Heads rested low, spines aligned with the ground. This kept blood warm and breathing steady. The ceiling felt closer when lying down, intentionally so. Heat could not escape upward easily. The shelter compressed warmth into the space where rest happened. Communal sleeping amplified this effect. Bodies radiated heat constantly, and when placed close together, that warmth accumulated into something stable. No fire could replace it. Alone, a shelter worked. Together, it worked better. Winter made proximity practical. There is debate among scholars about how sleeping arrangements reflected social structure. Some evidence suggests elders or the most vulnerable occupied the warmest positions. Other sites show more fluid movement, with places shifting as needs changed. What remains consistent is attentiveness. Warmth was allocated thoughtfully, not accidentally. Night underground did not erase awareness. It softened it. Even in sleep, people listened. A new draft, a change in air movement. The faint smell of smoke carried meaning. Attention did not disappear. It rested lightly, ready to return if needed. Silence played a role here too. Underground sound did not travel far. Loud movement felt intrusive. Stillness conserved energy. The shelter encouraged calm without enforcing it. Winter rewarded that calm quickly. As you lie still now, you feel how warmth does not surge and fade. It remains. It settles. It wraps rather than overwhelms. This kind of heat allows the body to let go. Fingers loosen. Breath slows. Muscles release their grip on the day. Above you, snow thickens. Below you, the ground stays patient. Between those two truths, sleep becomes possible not because danger has vanished, but because it has been managed quietly, carefully, and well. Silence underground was not empty. It was shaped, cultivated, and quietly useful in ways that open winter never allowed. Above the surface, sound carried danger. Wind screamed. Ice cracked. Trees split without warning. Every noise demanded attention and burned energy. Below ground, the earth absorbed vibration, rounding sharp edges of sound until what remained felt distant, manageable, almost gentle. This quiet changed how the body behaved. Breathing slowed naturally. Movements became deliberate rather than reactive. Even thought patterns softened. The mind stopped bracing for constant interruption. In winter, that mattered more than comfort. Panic exhausted the body faster than cold ever could. Silence preserved strength. Shelters were shaped to support this quiet, curved walls prevented echoes. Packed earth swallowed footsteps. Low ceilings kept voices close. Speaking softly became instinct, not rule. Loudness felt unnecessary, even wasteful. The shelter rewarded restraint with calm. Night deepened this effect. Without wind howling through gaps or branches striking walls, darkness became steady rather than threatening. Firelight flickered gently instead of fighting shadows. The shelter held sound the way it held warmth, without letting it escape or intrude. Children learned silence early, not through correction but through atmosphere. Loud play faded naturally underground. Stillness felt safer. Listening became more valuable than speaking. This did not erase joy. It reshaped it. Games became quieter. Stories longer. Attention sharpened. Silence also allowed awareness to travel farther inward. Small changes stood out. A shift in airflow. A new draft. The faintest scent of smoke. Underground living trained the senses to notice subtle signals before they became emergencies. Quiet made warning visible. Some researchers suggest that this cultivated silence contributed to decision-making under stress. Without constant sensory assault, people could respond rather than react. Winter rewarded that clarity. Mistakes still happened, but fewer were born of panic. Time behaved differently here, without the usual markers of day and night, without sound cues from the world above. Hours lost their sharp edges. Life followed internal rhythms rather than external pressure. People slept when tired, woke when rested. Winter allowed this flexibility underground, even as it denied it above. You feel it now, how silence wraps rather than isolates. It does not demand attention. It allows it to settle where it belongs. The shelter becomes not just a barrier against cold, but a buffer against noise, urgency, and unnecessary effort. Above you, the storm may still be moving, but it no longer speaks loudly enough to matter. Below, quiet continues its work, conserving energy, sharpening awareness, and making endurance feel almost natural. Living underground during winter did something subtle to time itself. Without sunrise spilling through windows or wind announcing every hour, days stopped arriving in neat segments. Morning did not demand urgency. Night did not threaten suddenly. Time softened, stretching and compressing according to need rather than light. This was not confusion. It was adaptation. In these shelters, life followed the body instead of the sky. People woke when rest was complete, not when daylight insisted. Work happened in slow, deliberate cycles shaped by warmth, hunger, and available energy. Winter punished rigid schedules. Underground living rewarded flexibility. This change altered memory. Events were not remembered by date but by condition. The storm when snow sealed the entrance completely. The week when embers were trusted through the night. The day the air shifted, and everyone felt it before understanding why. Memory anchored itself to sensation rather than sequence. Children grew within this rhythm naturally. They learned to measure time by routines: fire tending, meal preparation, quiet work, rest, rather than by hours. Winter education did not separate learning from living. Skills were absorbed gradually through repetition, without deadlines or ceremonies. Knowledge arrived when the body was ready to receive it. Storytelling filled the spaces time left open. Without external noise or constant motion, stories lengthened. They were told slowly, often repeated across many nights, changing slightly each time. These were not performances. They were memory maintenance. Stories carried instruction, caution, and reassurance without urgency. Winter allowed them to breathe. Some scholars suggest that this reshaping of time contributed to psychological resilience. When days no longer felt like obstacles to be crossed quickly, endurance became easier, anxiety softened, waiting became tolerable. The shelter did not rush anyone forward. It allowed stillness to feel productive. You feel this now, how nothing demands immediate response. The body relaxes into a pace that feels older than clocks. Breath deepens. Muscles stop anticipating interruption. Even thought slows, not from fatigue but from safety. Above ground, winter compresses time harshly. Cold shortens patience. Wind accelerates exhaustion. Below ground, time expands just enough to allow recovery. The difference matters. As the shelter continues holding warmth and quiet, time drifts without friction. Winter continues above, relentless and loud. But here, beneath the surface, it loses its ability to hurry you. And in that slowed world, endurance stops feeling like struggle and begins to feel like continuation. One breath, one ember, one quiet moment after another. After enough winters spent beneath the surface, the ground stopped feeling like a place you entered and began to feel like something that remembered you. The shelter was no longer just space. It carried traces of every season that had passed through it. Walls darkened slightly where hands rested. Floors smoothed where bodies slept. Fire scars recorded nights when cold pressed harder than expected. The earth kept these marks quietly, without judgment. Memory here did not live in objects alone. It lived in wear, in repetition, in the way a mat was placed without discussion, or a fire adjusted without instruction. People did not recall how things were done by reciting rules. They remembered by doing them again, winter after winter, until the movements felt inevitable. Certain places within the shelter gained meaning, without being named. A spot near the wall, where warmth always lingered. A place near the entrance where drafts appeared first. These were not measured or marked. They were known. The body learned them faster than the mind. Even newcomers felt it quickly, adjusting posture, choosing where to sit, where not to linger. Over generations, these shelters became layered with quiet decisions. Repairs were made not to restore an original design, but to respond to the last winter's lessons. A beam reinforced here, an entrance lowered slightly there. Nothing was sacred except what worked. The shelter evolved slowly, absorbing experience rather than preserving tradition for its own sake. Archaeological evidence reflects this continuity. Layers of ash tell stories of changing fire use. Floor compaction reveals shifting sleeping arrangements. Wall repairs show where pressure tested limits. The shelter does not present a single moment in time. It presents accumulation, winter after winter compressed into earth. Children growing up here inherited this memory without effort. They did not need to be told where warmth lived. Their bodies found it naturally. They learned which sounds mattered and which did not. They sensed when the shelter felt different. When attention was needed, memory arrived before language. Some scholars suggest that this kind of living created an unusually deep relationship with place, binding people to specific winter grounds. Others argue that mobility remained central, and that memory traveled with people rather than staying fixed in one location. Both views hold truth. The ground remembered, but so did the hands that shaped it. As you rest now, you feel this layered presence. The shelter does not feel empty even in silence. It feels used, understood, and patient. The earth does not erase what passes through it quickly. It absorbs, softens, and holds. Above you, winter continues its work, indifferent and exacting. Below you, the ground holds warmth and memory in equal measure. And between those two forces, life learned to continue without hurry, guided not by certainty, but by familiarity earned slowly, season by season. At some point, winter remained the same, but the answers to it began to change. The cold still arrived without apology. The wind still searched for weakness. Snow still pressed downward with patient weight. What shifted was not the season, but the way people were encouraged to live within it. New materials appeared. New building styles promised permanence, visibility, and height. Walls were raised instead of spaces being lowered. Homes began to stand against winter rather than beneath it. To someone unfamiliar with underground living, these changes looked like progress. To winter, they were simply different experiments. The earth shelters did not stop working. They were not proven wrong. They were simply used less often. Knowledge that once lived in daily habit slowly lost repetition, and without repetition, even correct knowledge weakens. Techniques that required constant attention, reading smoke, adjusting airflow, sensing drafts, became harder to maintain when winter survival was no longer practiced in the same way every year. Some tried to adapt underground principles without fully understanding them. Floors were sunken, but entrances poorly placed. Fire was used without restraint. Ventilation was copied without context. These shelters failed quietly, reinforcing the idea that underground living was dangerous rather than misunderstood. The earth did not change its rules. The listening changed. Over time, shelters that once returned winter after winter were left untouched. Roofs collapsed gently. Entrances filled. Grass grew. The land absorbed what had served its purpose. From the surface, nothing appeared lost. From below, warmth still waited. Elders remembered longer. They recalled which winters demanded depth, which required patience, which punished pride. But memory carried in people fades faster than memory carried in habit. When the body no longer performs the movements, the mind forgets why they mattered. Winter shelters became stories rather than systems. They were spoken of as clever solutions of the past, not as living answers. The earth was no longer entered as home, but studied as evidence. You can feel the difference now. The shelter still holds warmth. The silence still calms. The logic remains intact. But fewer people step inside long enough to let the body relearn what the ground offers freely. Above, winter continues unchanged. Below, the earth remains capable, patient, unoffended. It does not argue for relevance. It waits. And as the cold presses on the surface once again, The knowledge rests just beneath it, quiet, intact, and ready, should anyone choose to listen closely enough to remember how it was once used. The earth never forgot how to do its work, even as shelters were used less often, even as entrances filled and roofs softened back into soil. The ground beneath remained unchanged in its patience. Temperature still evened out below the frost line. Sound still faded. Wind still lost its power once it could no longer reach exposed skin. Nothing essential had been lost, only the habit of returning. You can sense this if you pause long enough, stand above a place where a shelter once rested, and feel how the ground behaves differently there. Snow melts unevenly. Frost lingers a little less aggressively. The soil gives slightly underfoot, not weak but familiar with pressure. The land remembers weight. It remembers warmth. In some regions, people return to these places briefly during especially harsh winters, not as a full return to old ways, but as a reminder that the ground still offered refuge when nothing else did. A temporary descent, a night or two beneath the surface, enough to let the body relearn what the mind had half forgotten. Relief arrived quickly, not dramatic, just immediate. What had faded was not effectiveness, but trust. Trust requires repetition. Without it, even proven systems feel uncertain. Underground living asked for humility, to crouch, to slow down, to let go of height and visibility. When values shifted toward permanence and dominance over the landscape, that humility felt unnecessary, even backward. Yet winter never changed its expectations. It still punished exposure. It still rewarded insulation. It still cared nothing for appearances. Each severe season quietly reminded anyone listening that the earth had always offered the same solution. You lie still now, and feel how little effort the shelter requires once inside. No walls to brace against wind. No constant tending to keep heat from fleeing. The ground does most of the work without complaint. It does not demand innovation. It asks for alignment. This waiting is not passive. The earth remains ready because it never stopped practicing. Soil still absorbs heat. Snow still insulates. Silence still calms the body. These are not historical facts. They are physical realities that do not expire. Knowledge, when removed from daily life, becomes fragile. But when reintroduced to the body, it returns quickly. The muscles remember how to move carefully. The senses sharpen. The shelter feels intuitive again within hours, not generations. Above, winter continues to arrive as it always has. Below, the ground remains unchanged, holding the same answer it has held for thousands of years. It does not advertise. It does not persuade. It simply waits. And in that waiting, there is no loss, only readiness for the moment when listening becomes necessary again. Even when the mind hesitated, the body remembered faster. The moment someone stepped beneath the surface again, the change was immediate and unmistakable. Shoulders lowered, breathing deepened. Muscles that had stayed tight against wind and exposure released their grip without being asked. The ground did not need explanation. It spoke directly to the nervous system. Cold above ground demands constant readiness. Every movement costs energy. Every sound triggers attention. Below ground, that demand fades. The body shifts from defense to maintenance. Heat stays close. Breath becomes slower and more efficient. Hunger sharpens less aggressively. Sleep arrives without struggle. These reactions are not cultural. They are biological. You feel it now. The shelter does not convince you that it is safe. It proves it through sensation. Temperature steadies. Sound dulls. Even darkness behaves differently. It surrounds rather than threatens. The body accepts this quickly because it has always known that stillness preserves heat and that earth moderates extremes better than open air ever could. This is why underground living could be forgotten intellectually yet rediscovered physically in a single night. Someone might doubt the idea, question the design, mistrust the logic, and then sleep deeply for the first time in days. The body answers before the mind finishes arguing. Across many accounts of people returning briefly to earth-sheltered spaces during severe winters, the same observations appear: less shivering, fewer waking hours, lower fuel consumption, calm replacing vigilance. These are not romantic impressions. They are measurable outcomes of insulation, thermal mass and silence working together. The shelter does not require belief. It requires presence. Once inside, the body adjusts automatically, finding the warmest place, conserving movement, responding to subtle changes in air and sound. Attention sharpens without stress. Awareness becomes quiet rather than frantic. Children adapt even faster, without preconceived ideas about how a home should look. They respond only to how it feels. Warmth is chosen. Stillness is learned. Comfort becomes instruction. The shelter teaches without words. This bodily memory explains why the knowledge never truly disappeared. It did not survive as diagrams or manuals. It survived as sensation, as relief, as the unmistakable feeling of winter losing its grip once you stepped beneath the surface. Above, the cold remains loud and impatient. Below, it becomes distant. The contrast does not need explanation. The body understands it immediately, and as you rest here, feeling warmth settle where it belongs, you begin to sense that remembering does not always start with thinking. Sometimes it begins with simply lying down in the right place, and letting the ground remind you of what it has always known how to do. At a certain point, winter stopped feeling like something aimed at you. Underground, cold, no longer felt like an attack or a test of endurance, but like a condition that existed elsewhere, moving across the surface of the world without direct access to your body. This distance mattered. When winter feels personal, it drains strength through constant resistance. When it feels distant, it becomes manageable. Above ground, every gust feels intentional. Wind presses against walls, finds gaps, announces itself with noise and movement. Snow piles aggressively, leaning into structures, testing them. Underground, winter loses this sense of agency. Snow becomes weight rather than threat. Cold becomes background rather than presence. The shelter removes winter's personality, turning it into a slow, predictable force instead of an adversary. This shift changed how people thought about survival. Endurance no longer required constant effort. Once the shelter was prepared, survival became maintenance rather than struggle. Fire did not need to roar. Bodies did not need to stay in motion. Attention could soften without becoming careless. Winter could be endured quietly. You feel this now. There is no need to brace yourself. The ground carries pressure evenly. Temperature does not surprise you. Sound does not demand response. The body stops interpreting the environment as hostile and begins treating it as stable. This conserves energy in ways that are difficult to explain but easy to feel. Some researchers describe this as a psychological advantage equal to any physical insulation. When the environment stops signaling danger continuously, stress hormones drop, sleep deepens, decision-making improves, even illness becomes less likely. Underground shelters provided not just warmth, but a sense of predictability that winter otherwise stripped away. This does not mean danger disappeared. Storms still arrived, food still mattered, fire still required care, but the shelter filtered these threats. Presenting them slowly in forms the body could respond to without panic. Winter became something to monitor rather than fight. You notice how even thoughts change here. Instead of racing ahead to imagine the worst, the mind stays near the present moment. Attention narrows to what matters immediately: warmth, breath, stillness. This focus is not forced. It emerges naturally when the environment stops overwhelming the senses. Children raised in these spaces learned this relationship early. Winter was not framed as an enemy, but as a season with rules. Follow them, and life continued. Ignore them, and consequences arrived. There was no need for fear-based teaching. The shelter itself demonstrated the difference. As you lie still, you sense how the earth absorbs not just cold but urgency. It does not hurry. It does not escalate. It does not dramatize. In doing so, it teaches the same behavior to anyone inside. Above, winter continues moving across the land, indifferent and exacting. Below, it becomes something you are aware of but not consumed by. And in that separation, survival becomes quieter, steadier, and far less exhausting than it ever is in the open. The shelter holds, the ground waits, and winter, for the first time, stops feeling like it is happening to you at all. Once winter stopped feeling personal, it also stopped feeling dramatic. Underground, survival lost its sharp edges and settled into routine, and routine, more than ingenuity or strength, is what carries people through long seasons without breaking them. The shelter did not require constant invention. It required consistency. The same checks each evening, the same small adjustments each morning, the same attention paid not to danger, but to balance. Days underground followed patterns shaped by efficiency rather than ambition. Fire was checked, not rebuilt. Entrances were brushed clear, not widened. Bedding was shifted slightly, not replaced unless needed. Food was taken in portions that matched the body's reduced movement. Nothing here invited excess. Winter punished excess quickly. The shelter rewarded moderation quietly. This rhythm mattered because it reduced decision fatigue. When the cold is constant, the mind cannot afford to make large choices every hour. Underground living simplified life into repeatable actions that required little debate. That simplicity preserved mental energy, allowing people to respond calmly when conditions truly changed. Archaeological evidence supports this steadiness, where patterns suggest repeated use of the same paths, the same tools, the same motions, not because people lacked creativity, but because reliability mattered more than variation. Winter did not reward novelty. It rewarded what worked yesterday. You feel this now in the way your body settles. There is nothing to solve, nothing to optimize. The shelter already knows what it needs. Your role is simply to participate in its rhythm. When hunger appears, it is addressed. When rest arrives, it is accepted. When the air shifts slightly, attention adjusts without urgency. Children absorbed this routine effortlessly. Repetition taught more effectively than instruction ever could. By watching the same tasks performed the same way each day, they learned what winter demanded and what it ignored. Routine became knowledge made physical. Some scholars argue that this predictability was as important as insulation itself. A stable environment reduces stress, lowers energy expenditure, and prevents the cascade of small errors that lead to catastrophe in extreme cold. Underground shelters created that stability not by controlling winter, but by limiting how much of it reached daily life. The shelter does not rush you. It does not push you to improve. It does not ask you to prove anything. It holds warmth, dampens sound, and allows routine to do its quiet work. Above ground, winter continues to change shape. Hour by hour, below ground, life moves slowly enough that change arrives with warning. That difference allows survival to become something practiced rather than something fought. As you remain here, breathing steadily, you sense how endurance is built, not from moments of brilliance, but from many uneventful days that pass without incident. The shelter makes those days possible. And as winter stretches on above, routine settles deeper below, carrying life forward one quiet repetition at a time. After enough time underground, the shelter itself faded from awareness. Not because it failed, but because it worked. When something answers a need consistently, the mind stops paying attention to it. Walls no longer feel like protection. They feel like absence of threat. The roof overhead does not register as structure. It registers as calm. This is where survival becomes invisible. Fire glows without drama. Air moves without sound. Warmth stays without effort. The shelter does not ask to be admired. It disappears into function. And in winter, disappearance is success. You feel it now. There is no urge to check the walls repeatedly. No impulse to brace against the cold. The body trusts the space without conscious approval. That trust did not arrive suddenly. It was earned slowly through nights that passed without incident, through storms that ended without consequence, through mornings where fingers still worked and breath still felt easy. Archaeological traces reflect this invisibility. The most successful shelters show fewer signs of frantic repair. Adjustments are subtle. Maintenance is quiet. Catastrophic failure leaves dramatic evidence. Reliable success leaves almost none. What remains is smoothness. Worn paths, settled floors, gently reshaped openings. The absence of urgency becomes the record. This disappearance of the shelter also reshaped attention outward. With survival stabilized, people could notice smaller things. The quality of light through the smoke hole, the sound of snow settling above, the way air shifted before a storm arrived. These details mattered not because they threatened life immediately, but because they informed gentle preparation. Children growing up in such spaces learned safety before fear. Their baseline expectation was warmth, not exposure. They did not marvel at the shelter. They assumed it. Winter, to them, was something that happened outside, not something that invaded daily life. That assumption shaped confidence rather than bravado. Some researchers suggest that this invisibility of survival systems is what allowed communities to endure long winters without psychological collapse. When effort fades into background routine, the mind is freed from constant vigilance. Calm becomes default. Stress becomes occasional rather than constant. You sense this now. The shelter no longer feels like a response to winter. It feels like a pause from it. A neutral space where cold exists but does not dominate thought. The earth absorbs urgency the way it absorbs sound. Above ground, winter still moves, reshaping the surface hour by hour. Below ground, life continues almost unchanged. That contrast is not dramatic. It is steady, and steadiness is what allows time to pass without erosion of strength. As you remain here, breathing slow and even, you realize that the greatest achievement of these underground shelters was not warmth alone, but forgetfulness. The ability to forget winter long enough for the body and mind to recover. The shelter holds quietly. The ground continues its patient work, and winter, unseen and unheard, loses its claim on your attention. At some point, winter no longer occupied the center of thought. It did not disappear, but it receded, moving to the edges of awareness where it belonged. Underground cold became a condition rather than a presence, something acknowledged but not negotiated with constantly. The shelter did not deny winter, it filtered it, softening its urgency until it could be managed without strain. You feel this shift in the way attention settles. There is no scanning for danger, no measuring of breath against temperature. The body stops calculating every movement. Energy stops leaking into unnecessary readiness. Winter becomes background noise, like a distant river heard faintly through stone. This change allowed other rhythms to return. Hands worked slowly without rushing. Tools were repaired carefully rather than urgently. Meals were prepared with patience instead of hunger-driven haste. Conversation unfolded without being cut short by cold. Underground living gave winter its place without allowing it to dominate everything else. Archaeological evidence hints at this quiet normalization. In well-established winter shelters, traces of daily life become more varied rather than more desperate. Craft work appears. Objects are reshaped rather than simply used until failure. These details suggest not leisure but margin, a small buffer of time and energy beyond mere survival. You notice how the shelter supports this margin. It does not require constant monitoring. Its success is steady enough that attention can move elsewhere. That freedom is subtle but profound. It allows people to remain human through winter, rather than becoming only survivors. Children especially benefited from this backgrounding of winter. When cold was no longer the primary signal shaping behavior, curiosity could return. Learning expanded beyond immediate necessity. Skills unrelated to survival were practiced quietly, woven into long nights without urgency. Winter stopped shrinking life, and instead shaped it gently. Some scholars argue that this ability to push winter into the background explains how communities could endure extreme climates without fragmentation. When hardship stops dominating thought, resilience grows naturally. Stress becomes episodic rather than constant. The shelter did not eliminate difficulty. It redistributed. You lie still and feel how little effort is required to remain warm now. The shelter has already done its work. Your role is simply to exist within it. Breath flows easily. Muscles rest. Thought drifts without tension. Above, the landscape remains locked in cold, shaped sharply by wind and snow. Below, life moves forward at a quieter pace. Winter is present, but it no longer defines the moment. And as the night stretches on, the shelter continues doing what it has done for countless winters before, not defeating the season, but setting it gently aside so life can continue without interruption. There comes a point when stillness itself becomes a form of strength, not the absence of action, but the result of everything being placed exactly where it needs to be. Underground, movement is no longer used to fight cold. It is reserved for moments that matter. Every unnecessary gesture costs heat. Every unnecessary decision costs energy. The shelter teaches this quietly, without rules, by making stillness feel correct. You sense how the body adapts to this lesson. Muscles remain relaxed but ready. Breath stays deep and even. The urge to pace or adjust fades. Stillness no longer feels like waiting. It feels like participation. The shelter works best when the people inside allow it to do so. Winter above thrives on motion. Wind accelerates. Snow drifts and reshapes constantly. Exposure demands response after response. Below ground, stillness interrupts that cycle. The earth absorbs motion until what remains is calm. This calm is not weakness. It is efficiency. Archaeological traces suggest that long-term winter shelters show fewer signs of frantic activity as the season deepens. Early winter layers carry more movement. Repairs, adjustments, repositioning. Later layers grow quieter. Patterns settle. Tools remain where they are needed. Fire scars stabilize. The shelter reaches equilibrium, and so do the people inside it. You feel this equilibrium now. Nothing asks for immediate correction. Nothing feels on the verge of failure. Attention drifts not because it must, but because it can. This state conserves more energy than any additional layer of insulation ever could. Children learn this form of strength early. They watch adults move only when necessary, speak only when needed, conserve warmth without being told to do so. Stillness becomes normal rather than enforced. Energy is valued not for what it produces, but for how carefully it is spent. Some researchers suggest that this cultivated stillness had lasting effects beyond winter. Communities accustomed to conserving energy developed patience, restraint, and attentiveness that shaped other parts of life. Whether this can be proven remains debated, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Winter rewards those who do less, but do it well. You notice how time stretches again here. Without constant motion, moments lengthen. The shelter does not push you forward. It allows you to remain where you are without consequence. That permission is rare in harsh environments. Above, winter continues reshaping the land through force. Below, life continues by reducing force to the minimum required. The contrast is not dramatic, but it is decisive. As you rest, you understand that these underground shelters did not simply protect people from cold. They taught a different way of being during hardship, one where strength came not from resistance, but from alignment, restraint, and the quiet confidence of knowing that nothing needs to be done right now. The shelter holds, stillness deepens, and winter, unable to provoke reaction, continues on without you. In the end, what these underground shelters reveal is not a lost technology, but a relationship that never truly disappeared. Winter did not change. Cold did not soften. Wind did not learn mercy. What changed was the way people chose to position themselves within those forces, lowering rather than rising, listening rather than resisting, allowing the earth to carry part of the burden that the human body could not. These shelters were never monuments. They were never meant to last forever or be admired from a distance. Their success was measured in silence, in nights that passed without incident, in mornings where fingers still worked and breath still felt easy. When they worked best, they disappeared from attention entirely, becoming background, becoming routine, becoming something the body trusted enough to forget. The knowledge that built them did not live in blueprints or fixed rules. It lived in repetition, in habit, in sensation. It lived in knowing where warmth settled, how smoke behaved, when stillness conserved more energy than motion ever could. It lived in the earth itself, waiting patiently beneath the frost line, unchanged by centuries or borders. Even when these shelters were no longer used, the principles they embodied never stopped working. Soil still moderates temperature, snow still insulates, silence still calms the body, stillness still preserves strength. The earth never withdrew its offer, it simply waited. And perhaps that is the quiet truth winter teaches best. Survival does not always come from building higher or fighting harder. Sometimes it comes from stepping aside, lowering yourself, and letting something older and steadier hold you for a while. As you rest now, imagine the ground beneath you doing what it has always done, remembering warmth, softening sound, slowing time. Winter continues above, indifferent and exacting. But here, beneath the surface, life persists without urgency. The shelter does not ask to be remembered. It does not ask to be praised. It simply remains ready for anyone who chooses to listen again. And with that, you can let the earth hold the night and allow yourself to drift.